Yo, what is going on, everyone? My name is Nick with the Notorious Fantasy. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about my do not draft wide receiver list for fantasy football in 2021. Inside of today's video, I'm going to be talking about 4 wide receivers that I am looking to be fading based upon where they are going at average draft position right now in late July. Now, by the time you guys are drafting in late August or early September, things can end up changing. Players can move their ADP based upon training camp news, based upon things that happen in preseason, and based upon injuries going around the player. Obviously, one of these players can end up getting hurt, knock on wood. We obviously do not root for injuries here, so make sure that if you guys do want an updated version of this video inside of August, to make sure that you hit that subscribe button down below if you are new, because not only is it free, me and the guys at Awesemo Fantasy Football are going to be posting content every single day. My videos go up Monday through Friday, so please make sure that you guys do hit that subscribe button down below so that we can help you win your 2021 Fantasy Football Championship. I'd also like to ask if whether you are new or not to please make sure to hit that like button down below, because it helps boost this video up the algorithm so that more beautiful people like yourself can see today's masterpiece of a video. So the first player and first wide receiver, obviously, I want to be talking about today is of the Cleveland Browns wide receiver, Odell Beckham Jr., current ADP wide receiver number 28, overall pick 59.5. Now, every single year, every big fantasy analyst in the industry seems to talk about how they are out on Odell Beckham Jr., how they don't want to draft Odell Beckham Jr. Last year, I was preaching to the fantasy football heavens that Odell Beckham Jr. was going to be a complete and utter waste of a 5th round pick. And every single year, people start talking themselves back into Odell. People will be like, at the end of the season, they'll be like, I drafted Odell. He was a complete and utter fucking bust from my roster. So you know what? I'm not going to draft him next year. And then they start thinking, oh, I remember Odell in New York. I remember that one-handed catch. That's what most people start thinking about. And then, boom, he skyrockets up the draft. And he's like a 4th or 5th round pick yet again in 2021. That would honestly be my guess as to where he gets drafted by the time it's late August or early September, because of the hype a player like Odell Beckham Jr. has and the name recognition Odell Beckham Jr. has, because not everyone plays in a fantasy football league with a bunch of people who are watching videos in July like yourself. Shout out to you. They are drafting with people who 3 minutes before the draft, they go ahead and try to cram 30,000 YouTube videos at the same time, or they just go ahead and print off a list off the internet and try to win their league based upon that. And those are the kind of people that like Odell Beckham Jr. because he's a flashy player. And I believe that Odell Beckham Jr.'s ADP is going to rise from where it is now. But even where it is now, I'm going to give you guys an attack of numbers here, just a rapid fire of numbers that are going to tell you why Odell Beckham Jr. is simply not going to be that guy yet again in 2021. So first, I want to take a look at last year's stats. In 7 games, Odell Beckham Jr. finished as the wide receiver 89 in PPR, 85.5 PPR, and the wide receiver 75 in standard. From points per game perspective, he was the wide receiver number 39 in PPR. He was the wide receiver 35.5 PPR, tied with Cooper Kupp and Sterling Shepard, and he was the wide receiver number 25 in standard, tied with Scary Terry F1 McLaurin, averaging 12.4 PPR points per game, 10.8 half PPR points per game, and 10.1 standard points per game. So I know the average person is going to say, but Nick, I realize that Odell Beckham Jr. only played in 7 games, so he's going to be fine if he plays in all 16 or 17 games, that is this season, right? So let's look at his stats from last year, and then I'm going to show you a full 16-game slate out of Odell Beckham Jr. from 2019, and 2019 is before they brought in Kevin Stefanski, who is a notoriously run-heavy coach. So, last season, Odell Beckham Jr. had a grand total of 44 targets, 6.3 per game ranking, 94th at wide receiver. He had 23 receptions on those 44 targets, 101st at wide receiver, 319 receiving yards, 4 total touchdowns, a 15% rate, which is just a crazy rate. So you're like, oh, those stats were all right, even though those are very bad, having 44 targets and just 23 receptions. But let's look at 2019 now. Let's look at a more pass-happy version of the Cleveland Browns. Let's see. Odell Beckham Jr., 133 targets, 12th highest at wide receiver, 74 receptions, 18th highest at wide receiver, 1,035 receiving yards, 23rd at wide receiver, and 4 total touchdowns. And from a half PPR points per game perspective, he was wide receiver 33. Wide receiver 33 in 16 games with 133 targets on a pass-happy version of this offense. The offense now is head coached by Kevin Stefanski. Kevin Stefanski is the guy who fed Dalvin Cook the rock repeatedly in Minnesota. He is the guy who fed Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt last year repeatedly in Cleveland. What do you think is going to happen in 2021? Do you think they're just going to open up and be this ultra pass-heavy attack? No. Last year, after Odell Beckham Jr. went down, we saw the Cleveland Browns have some type of emergence, like Odell Beckham Jr. was holding the team down. Now, I'm not saying that that's exactly what was happening, because I don't know. But what I do know is that I'm not drafting a wide receiver that I believe is washed up at this point in his career. He's only 28 years old, but he's still somehow fucking washed up. And I know people are to think that, oh, Nick, you're just an Odell Beckham Jr. hater. I'm not an Odell hater. I believe Odell Beckham Jr. still has some skill left in him. I just don't think we're ever going to see that in Cleveland because of how run-heavy they are. And I think where he's going right now is just absurd for what we've seen in 2019 and 2020 for Odell in a Cleveland Browns uniform. So don't be surprised if you draft Odell Beckham Jr. in the middle rounds again, that he is going to spank you 50 Shades of Grey style for having drafted him. Next up, we've got wide receiver of the Seattle Seahawks, DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf, ADP wide receiver overall, number 6 right now, pick 21.6. Now, my dislike for drafting DK Metcalf does not come from hating a guy like DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf is basically what you would have if you're an NFL GM. You're having a wet dream that you could be drafting a guy that looks like DK Metcalf. The dude's jacked. He's 6'3", 228 pounds, runs a 4.33 40-yard dash, which is 99th percentile. The guy has humongous arms. He's going to catch every single ball thrown his way. He can run super fast. You saw it up against Arizona when he chased down that defender after they picked off Russell Wilson. He chased him down. That guy, DK Metcalf, is just an insane specimen of a human. But again, my do not want to draft of this player is not because of who he is. DK Metcalf is an excellent NFL wide receiver, but I believe that things are going to be a little bit like last year, but they have the potential to get worse because Tyler Lockett last year was ultra inconsistent. This guy would have 4 games where he played like shit. He just played terrible. But then the next week, after having 4 terrible games, he drops a deuce, shout out to Odell Beckham Jr., on the defense. And then the next week, he plays terrible, and then he plays hot again. So he was very inconsistent. But what I noticed was when Tyler Lockett was having these huge splashes, Metcalf was shriveling up. He was shriveling up. And then what I noticed was that when Metcalf was doing good, Lockett was shriveled up. So, what does that mean? What if Lockett has more better games than he had last season? Riddle me that, because then DK Metcalf is screwed in a lot of these games, and my biggest worry is that the Seattle Seahawks are going to try to run the ball. There are a couple of things in Pete Carroll's DNA. It's a bunch of gum because he munches the gum on the sideline, and it's also to run the football down the defense's throat, unless you're on the goal line of the Super Bowl, because in that game, why would you run the ball? You know, that doesn't make too much sense. Why win the Super Bowl when you can let the Patriots intercept the ball? But without trying to demolish Seahawks fans' happiness, DK Metcalf is going to be on a team that tries to establish the run. No matter how much Russell Wilson cooks up a 5-star meal back there at the quarterback position, how much he looks to dissect the defense, it does not matter. Because Pete Carroll does whatever Pete Carroll wants, and that is to try to create a run-heavy environment. The thought process, the retaliation to that thought would be that, hey, you remember the Seattle defense from last year. They weren't very good, and I admit it, but they started looking better at the end of the season, and if they increase to get even better in 2021, then maybe Seattle does try to really run the rock down the throat with Chris Carson, and that hurts DK as well as Tyler Lockett and Russell Wilson. In 16 games, Metcalf was the wide receiver 7 in PPR, 7.5 PPR, and the wide receiver number 5 in standard, averaging 17 PPR points per game, 14.4 half PPR points per game, and 11.8 standard points per game, meaning from a points per game perspective, Metcalf was the wide receiver 10 in PPR, 8.5 PPR, and the wide receiver number 8 in standard, putting up a grand total of 129 targets on the season, ranking 14th highest at the wide receiver position, 83 receptions, 17th highest at wide receiver, 1,303 receiving yards, which is about 81.4 per game, ranking 6th at wide receiver, and 10 total touchdowns, ranking 7th highest at the wide receiver position. Those numbers are amazing, and I agree with that. But he only had a 21% target share, ranking 86th at wide receiver. And if Tyler Lockett goes back to being the Tyler Lockett that he's been in the past, which is a more consistent version of what we saw last year, then I think DK Metcalf is really going to struggle. I think that this is going to be a very controversial take right now because it feels like everyone and their mother is all in on DK Metcalf. And I do somewhat understand it, but personally, I'm just not willing to pay the price at wide receiver 6 for a wide receiver on a team that I believe is going to try to run the ball a lot more, and for a player that I'm not even sure is going to be the wide receiver 1 in targets in Seattle in 2021. Next up, we have a wide receiver that a couple of months ago, I was all over drafting this guy, but now I have come to a realization that he is just... the odds may not be in his favor. Shout out to the fucking Hunger Games and Jennifer Lawrence. So DJ Chark is the wide receiver I'm going to be talking about here of the Jacksonville Jaguars. ADP wide receiver number 34. Overall pick 73.4. And if I'm being honest with you, on a lot of websites, he's going much higher than that. But before we get into this breakdown of DJ Chark, please make sure that if you have ended up enjoying thus far to hit that subscribe button, and make sure you hit that like button down below as well. And you know what? Fuck it. Make sure you leave a comment down below as well. Let me know if you like these players that I'm talking about. You're like, hey, Nick, you're wrong. I think you should be drafting these wide receivers. If you agree, you say, hey, Nick, great video. I really enjoyed this. Thank you very much. I would really appreciate that. So, DJ Chark, wide receiver of the Jacksonville Jaguars. The reason why I've started to fall out of love with DJ Chark is because I came to this realization that there's a pretty good chance that he's not the wide receiver 1 in targets in Jacksonville. There's a pretty good chance that the ADP for Laviska Shenault going a couple rounds later is much juicier. And there's a also thought process in my head that Marvin Jones going even later than that, who's going like the 11th, 10th round of some drafts, is near kind of free almost when you think about it like that. And he also has a very good chance to be the wide receiver 1 in Jacksonville. This is a completely different regime to what DJ Chark had in the past, like in 2019 when he had that breakout season. Last year in 2020, Chark upset me immensely because I drafted him to potentially have wide receiver 2 potential, and he was not that at all. In 13 games, Chark finished as the wide receiver 48 in PPR, 48.5 PPR, as well as in standard, averaging 11.8 PPR points per game, 9.8 half PPR points per game, and 7.7 standard points per game, meaning from points per game perspective, DJ Chark was the wide receiver 43 in PPR, 42.5 PPR, and 41 in standard. So, those numbers aren't the greatest, but you can almost discount it, and that's what I was doing earlier on in the offseason. I was discounting. I was saying, yeah, but they benched Gardner Minshew. Gardner Minshew was healthy, and they didn't play Gardner Minshew, so you throw the numbers out, right? You can just discount it, and you look back at 2019, and he had great numbers. But then I came to the realization that DJ Chark probably could not be the guy getting the number 1 amount of targets for Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence might have a liking to Laviska. He might have a liking to Marvin Jones. So where he's going right now, I think you're paying too high of a price for a guy that may not even be the wide receiver 1 on the Jaguars in targets and could easily be the wide receiver 3 in targets on the team, depending on who Trevor Lawrence likes. Last year, DJ Chark had 94 targets, 7.2 per game, ranking 40th at wide receiver. He had 53 total receptions, 48th at the wide receiver position, 706 receiving yards, and 5 total tutties, 35th highest at the wide receiver position. So it's not much to do, just like with Metcalf, with DJ Chark's talent, because I believe DJ Chark has immense talent. He showed it off in 2019, but it's more about how this team is going to work. Urban Meyer has already put DJ Chark in the pit by just roasting the guy. He said that DJ Chark played small last season. The question is, who will be his favorite target? And I don't think we can answer that question in July. I think in a couple of weeks, we will have a better answer to that. And he could easily be a must-draft wide receiver. If I see reports out of training camp, DJ Chark is the wide receiver number 1. He's getting the most targets. And in preseason, when Lawrence is playing, oh, he's throwing it to DJ Chark. And then, boom, you're very excited to be drafting DJ Chark. But right now, I believe that the risk is heavily outweighing the reward, because he could easily be the wide receiver 3 in targets on that team. Final player here, wide receiver of the Baltimore Ravens, Hollywood Marquise Brown, wide receiver of the Baltimore Ravens. Hollywood Brown is a fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, can't get fooled again. Fool me 3 times, He's fooled you 3 times now. It's 2021, drafted in 2019. He had that game, week 1 of his rookie season, where he torched the defense. Just torched them. And then didn't really do much. 2020, people are like, man, we remember that game week 1. Let's draft him again. Bust. 2021, people are going to talk themselves up. He's already up plus 4.47 picks right now on overall picks, on overall draft position, 88.7 right now. Overall wide receiver, 44. People are going to hype him up because he's fast. But you want to know what Hollywood Brown is? Hollywood Brown is like Tyler Lockett, but the Walmart version. He's like discount Tyler Lockett, but not discount because like, hey, I found it for $1 and it's actually close to as good as Tyler Lockett. No. This is like hope that Lamar Jackson throws the ball a bunch of times in the game when they brought in another bunch of wide receivers here in Baltimore. You want to know why they brought in these other wide receivers? Because Hollywood Brown is not a excellent receiver at catching the ball a million times in the game. He's a big play guy. He's going to have 3 games next year where he blows his ADP out of the water. He drops like 35 points or something crazy, right? And you're like, wow, I should have started Hollywood Brown. And then the next week you start Hollywood Brown and he scores 4 points. Or he puts up a goose egg and scores 0. Hollywood Brown is that kind of super high upside player that you're playing on DraftKings, that you're playing on FanDuel. He's a DFS play where you're just rolling the dice. You're like, please, let this be a Hollywood Brown week. So you roll the dice. But in fantasy football redraft, why would you draft Hollywood Brown? Why not look for an upside wide receiver that's going to have potential to have big games every week, which is something that Hollywood Brown just does not have, and he's on a team that likes to run the ball. He has a quarterback that's not the greatest at hitting deep balls to a quarterback. Now, I like Lamar Jackson, or to a wide receiver. I like Lamar Jackson, but Lamar Jackson is not the type of quarterback for a guy like Hollywood Brown. Hollywood Brown last year in 16 games finished as the wide receiver number 36 in PPR, 34.5 PPR, and 32 in standard, averaging 11.4 PPR points per game, 9.6 half PPR points per game, and 7.8 standard points per game. Meaning, from a points per game perspective, he was wide receiver 47 in PPR, 43.5 PPR, tied with Emmanuel Sanders and Devontae Parker, and wide receiver 34 in standard, tied with Cooper Kupp. Hollywood had 99 targets last year, 35th at the wide receiver position, 58 receptions, 769 receiving yards, and 8 total touchdowns, 13th highest at wide receiver. So he's not really a guy that's going to be seeing 110 plus targets, and that's something you can find in a similar range to where Hollywood Brown is going in drafts right now. You can also find wide receivers that are on teams that like to throw the ball. And you can find wide receivers that are on a team with a quarterback who is able to throw that deep ball effectively every single time. Or not every single time, right? Not every quarterback can throw the ball every single time like that. To show you that his target share is humongous in this offense. 25.2% target share in this offense, 12th highest at the wide receiver position, and he had 99 targets. That's because Lamar Jackson does not throw the fucking football that much. So stay away from Hollywood Brown. Stay clear away. I'd rather draft Sammy Watkins in the 15th round and hope that he graces the field week 1 and has that 50-point game that he always has week 1. There's only 3 things inevitable in life. I just kind of ruined the joke, but it's death, taxes, and Deshaun Jackson, week 1 DFS smash, and Sammy Watkins, week 1 DFS smash. Both of those guys, every single year, week 1, without fail, puts up an excellent performance. So let me know down below what you guys think about these wide receivers. Do you think I'm crazy for fading any of these players? Are you with me? Are you right on board that Odell Beckham Jr., DK Metcalf, DJ Chark, and Hollywood Brown are do not draft candidates for fantasy football in 2021? Thank you guys all so much for watching throughout this whole video. I really appreciate it. Make sure that you leave a comment down below to let me know that you enjoyed. Make sure you hit that like button and hit that subscribe button for more videos every single day. Hopefully you guys enjoy the live stream that is going to be coming your way on Friday with me and Dave. So thank you guys for watching. I love you guys all. Make sure you have a great rest of your guys' day. Stay safe as always. Goodbye.